Good evening. Thank you for being here and to welcome you to our second talk as part of the Academy of Mindfulness and Contemplative Studies. My name is Anne Vallely, and I'm a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies. It's my personal pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Roth. And for several years, in fact, I've been wanting Dr. Roth to come to Ottawa in person and meet with everyone who has anything to do with contemplative studies here in the city, whether that's brain and mind researchers or administrators who are building programs or professors who are bringing contemplative practices into the classroom. He is the most, I would say, foremost figure in the field of contemplative studies. And I know that that embarrasses you, Dr. Roth, but I do consider you a luminary in this field of contemplative studies. So I'm really delighted that you're here to join us. And I hope that at some point you'll be able to join us on campus. So I'll just let you know a little bit about the background of Dr. Roth. He's a professor of religious studies and founding director of the Contemplative Studies Initiative at Brown University. He's a specialist in Chinese philosophy and textual analysis, the classical Taoist tradition, the comparative study of contemplative experiences, and a pioneer in the academic field of contemplative studies, in which he created the first bachelor's degree program at a major research university in North America. And that program at Brown was an inspiration to our program here at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Roth has written and edited 9 books and more than 50 scholarly articles in areas including the text The Original Tao, published in 1999, which is a translation and analysis of the oldest text on breath meditation in China. He also wrote an article called Against Cognitive Imperialism, which is a critique of conceptual bias in cognitive sciences and religious studies. And this was an article that, for me personally, had a really powerful impact in my thinking about the role of first person or experiential learning. And I think it should be required reading, not just for those who are interested in contemplative studies or in religious studies, but actually any of us who are engaged in the business of knowledge production here at the university. Harold Roth also is author of the Huainan Zi, A Guide to the Theory and Practice of Government in Early China, as well a text entitled The Contemplative Foundations of Classical Daoism, published in 2021. And finally, a text called Manifesting Zen, Master Dharma Talks from Mount Baldy by Kyozan Josu Sasaki Roshi, which he describes as a passion project, which he has spent the last 8 years engaged in, and which will be formally published April 1st. So congratulations on that, Hal, and thank you very much again for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for your very kind and overly generous introduction. And I'd like to welcome people. Thank you for coming out tonight. And I hope to be able to join you on campus one of these days, perhaps on a day when it isn't quite yet still March. and perhaps sometime in the fall semester, early in the fall semester when it's warmed up. It's pretty cold here down in Rhode Island today, reaching about 30. But I can only imagine, I mean, that's Fahrenheit, but I can only imagine what it is in Ottawa. Probably not quite that warm. So I'd like to take you through a presentation today that deals with a classical Taoist text, an original Taoist text, but also a way to analyze it through the lens of contemplative studies. One of the foundational texts of the Taoist tradition, the Zhuangzi, has this wonderful chapter called "The Perspective That Equalizes Things," and this is the passage that I want to analyze in my talk today, commenting on the human tendency to divide the world up into it, the ideas to which we are attached, and other, the ideas to which we are opposed. The great 4th century BCE Taoist sage Zhuangzi said, "No thing is not other. No thing is not it. If you treat yourself as other, they do not appear." This is why sages open things to the lucid light of the heavens. Theirs too is what he calls a cognizing by circumstance. I will rephrase this as a flowing cognition. So just to situate Zhuangzi geographically, he's from this area right along the border between Qin and Chu. These are known as the Warring States. This designation of the Warring States period lasts from about 475 BCE to 221 BCE. Eventually, this Qin state in the west conquers and unifies all of China, and they're the people who build the Great Wall. Obviously not the leaders, they didn't build the Great Wall, but they had the idea. And eventually, China expands to here and expands more eventually into where we are today in China. So what is Taoism? Well, the traditional view is that it's one of, and this is still true, China's 2 indigenous religions and philosophies. That's still true. But according to tradition, Taoism was founded by this shadowy figure who is named Lao Tzu. Well, Lao Tzu really means old master. Supposedly lived in the 6th century BCE. He taught his rival Confucius on how to perform rituals correctly. The key to all Confucian teaching is ritual. So this already should speak of a little spiritual polemics that should make you suspicious. On his way west out of China, according to legend, he was asked to write down his teachings, and the result is this famous book that probably some of you have heard about, many of you have heard about, the Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching, the single most famous book, I would argue, in all of Chinese culture. On his way out, he fortunately posed for this painting. Very nice of him to do that. According to tradition, he also had many disciples, including Wenzi and the person whose passage I just read you, Zhuangzi and Lietze, and each wrote a text that survived. And together they founded a school of philosophical Taoism. And these texts advocated, among other things, the existence of an absolute force or power in the world they called the Tao, and a surrender to death as a natural transformation. Somehow these lofty mystical texts, half a millennium later, became the basis for a formal religion that featured worship of Lao Tzu as a deity, practices aimed at longevity and immortality, and it's a religion that absorbed much of the religious beliefs of the peasants. And it seems to have represented an apparently major degeneration of the lofty mystical philosophy of Lao Tzu and his disciples. However, recent textual discoveries have led to a fundamental reassessment of early Taoism, leading to some new conclusions. First and foremost, really, is that the Lao Tzu of the 6th century BCE is a mythological invention. Secondly, the text attributed to him is really a 3rd century BCE compilation. That's much later. Thirdly, that there is no major gulf between so-called philosophical and religious forms of Taoism, but instead a profound continuity between cosmology and meditation practice. Many other significant sources of early Taoism, other than the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi, include Neye. This is a particularly important text. Neye means inward training. That's how it's commonly translated. And this work contains the oldest surviving discussion of meditative practice and the cosmology of the Tao, the way that is derived from this practice. When we examine the Taoist tradition from the position that Neye is its oldest text, not the Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching, a much greater continuity with the later institutionalized Taoist religion can be seen. And so there are these fundamental texts. Neya, which itself is really unusual because it didn't really circulate independently. It was one of 76 works in a collection called the Guanzi. And within that collection, and the other 72 texts are devoted to political and economic thought. So, I mean, I can, if you want to know later in the question period how how this happened, there's some theories I can talk about, but I won't take us that far afield. Um, so, Neya is the oldest of four short texts devoted to the exploration of breathing meditation and the insights it produces. They're known as the Techniques of the Mind texts. Therefore, it is the oldest text on breath focusing meditation in all of East Asia, was likely written down around 330 BCE, but it clearly shows the marks of oral transmission, earlier oral transmission. Of course, the Tao Te Ching, the way and its potency or power or resonance, it's the most revered work in the Chinese tradition. There are hundreds of Chinese editions of the text. I think we got disconnected, and nobody's quite sure why. So we're going to take another 30 seconds or so. Thank you all for coming back. Looks like most of you are coming back, so I very much appreciate. Uh, so we talked about the Lao Tzu. That's the Tao Te Ching. That's one of the most important foundational texts of the Taoist tradition. If you have looked at it, you see that it has 81 verses. They're all called chapters. We can talk about why that is, but they're really not chapters, they're really verses. And there are no textual references, despite the legend that Lao Tzu lived in the 6th century BCE and schooled Confucius on how to perform his essential practices. There is no evidence of the text existing of the Tao Te Ching before the middle of the 3rd century BCE. Because there are no references. So probably the text was compiled sometime between 275 and 250 BCE. The Zhuangzi is this wonderful mixed collection of Taoist narratives, short essays, and poetry ascribed to Zhuangzhou. It originally contained 52 chapters and now only contains 33. That 33 chapter version descends from another version that dates around 312 of the Common Era, so CE. It's divided into inner, outer, and miscellaneous sections, and the inner section contains the thought of Zhuangzhou. And it is from this section that we take the subject of our talk today, to take yourself as other. In other words, self-alterity, to otherize yourself. Now, having introduced the text to you, I want to stand back and introduce a different way of analyzing the text than a traditional humanities-only approach. And it's what I would call a contemplative studies approach. In the last 35 years, researchers in the brain sciences and their clinical counterparts have taken a great interest in the contemplative traditions, particularly those from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And from this has emerged this new field of contemplative studies. Contemplative studies as an academic field that has emerged in the last decade and a half studies the underlying philosophy, psychology, and phenomenology of contemplation, focuses on the many ways to concentrate, broaden, and deepen conscious awareness as the gateway to leading more ethically responsible, healthier, and personally fulfilling lives, identifies the varieties of contemplative experiences, examines scientific and humanistic research on them, cultivates direct first-person knowledge of them, assesses their meaning and significance, and contextualizes these experiences within their historical and cultural traditions. We're taking another few seconds to welcome back people after the second spontaneous break. The Taoist tradition really emphasizes the importance of spontaneity and ability to respond uh, spontaneously to whatever situation arises. And I want to thank the technical staff here for, I think, resolving the problem. Um, and I want to thank you all for coming back, or most of you. I think a couple people just went, oh, to hell with it. And
Thank you, Dr. Roth, for your equanimity. You're just, this is remarkable the way in which you're responding to this as well. So thank you
oh,
for your
you're
persistence.
very welcome. Yeah, I'm stubborn. Um, Not necessarily the best trait, but in such circumstances. So, actually, these are appropriate breaks. So, I hope you got a nice stretch. Uh, and I was talking about the interlocking areas of contemplative studies. Uh, and they are the sciences, particularly the brain sciences, cognitive science, neuroscience, psychology, um, and the clinical applications of mindfulness and meditation and contemplative practices on both individual and community levels. The various humanities, particularly philosophy, classics, religious studies, um, the creative arts, the study of the role of contemplation in the creation and appreciation of visual and fine arts, creative writing, and the various performing arts. But of course, if you talk about contemplative studies, you have to tell people what you mean by contemplation. And this is the working definition that we continue to try to improve. Uh, so it's the focusing of the attention in a sustained fashion, leading to deepened states of concentration, tranquility, and insight, a broadening of the awareness, self contextualizing experiences that are the basis of other regarding virtues such as empathy, compassion, and love, and which provide a crucial foundation for social engagement. Um, Contemplative practices occur on a spectrum from the rather common spontaneous experiences of absorption in an activity that all of us experience at one time or another in our lives to the most profound experiences deliberately cultivated in religious traditions. And so, really, what we talk about is their contemplative practices are intentional. We have two categories, basically. Practices that are deliberately focused on attaining contemplative states of focused attention, clear insight into the continuum of human experience, with the goal of realizing our full potential as human beings. Those are intentional. Non intentional are practices that lead to deeply focused attention that are done for the sake of the practices, not for the goal of having a contemplative state. And so, in that latter category are the experiences that Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, in his pioneering work from some three decades ago, refers to as flow. I would call this non-intentional contemplation or non-intentional contemplative experience. Psychological flow captures the positive mental state of being completely absorbed, focused, and involved in your activities at a certain point in time, as well as, of course, deriving enjoyment for being engaged in such an activity. Some people talk about it as being in the zone, and it can happen through a wide variety of activities that human beings have engaged in throughout human history. The scientific research on, uh, that we include within contemplative studies is relatively recent. I mean, it goes back between 30 and 40 years, depending on when you want, how you want to define the beginning, when you want to say it begins. This is, by the way, is an fMRI about to happen with Dr. Richie Davidson, whom some of you know, the leading neuroscientist of contemplative experience in the world, and of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama with him. They work very closely together and were associated with the founding of the Mind and Life Institute. Um, so, scientific research on meditation is taken from a wide range of wisdom traditions and consciousness transforming practices, including Hindu yoga and meditation, Buddhist mindfulness and insight practices, Taoist moving and still meditations, Zen Buddhist Zazen practices, and Christian centering prayer. And we can say there are four general areas of scientific research on contemplation. Uh, Neuroscience, we saw an example just in the previous slide, that includes EEG studies, fMRI studies, magnetic encephalography studies, in the cognitive sciences, clinical sciences, and in the area of positive psychology. So Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow falls in this latter area. What do these studies show? That meditation produces definitively measurable changes in the structure and functioning of the brain and body. These include significant improvements in attentional focus, a wide variety of positive emotional changes, and increasing prosocial behavior. That the entire range of contemplative experiences, including meditation, can enhance the quality of human life, and that meditation can be used as an effective clinical tool in the treatment of a wide range of illnesses. But while scientists have been taking increasing interest in humanistic research on contemplative practices in order to refine their research protocols, as a rule, however, humanists have not been so eager to examine how scientific research might impact their own scholarship. What I'd like to address today is an example. I'd like to demonstrate today an example of one direction that the other side of this two-way street might take. So recent scientific studies on the nature of consciousness have opened up new vistas through which to approach the study of classical texts and the experience of those who have created them. And this is what I'd like to bring to bear on this passage about taking yourself as other. Until recently, Eurocentric models of human cognition have dominated philosophy, religious studies, and the various cognitive sciences. In an essay that Professor Vallely kindly referred to, that I published about a decade and a half ago, I argued that this has resulted in a limited viewpoint of human cognition and human potential that vastly oversimplifies cognition and divides it almost exclusively into rational and emotional dimensions. Such models, because they completely negate the value of subjective experience in the attempt to paint a truly objective picture of consciousness, in the only way they assert it truly counts, from the outside in, fail to adequately account for the richness of human conscious experience. So, how is it possible, using a contemplative studies approach to consciousness and its various transformations, can you use it in a way that is open to the richness of subjectivity, but that avoids the serious pitfalls of solipsism and narcissism that have been what subjective experience has been thought of as constituting previously? So through something that we've developed that we call contemplative epistemology, an approach that we emphasize in our classroom teaching, we can actually apply that to investigating different types of contemplative texts and practices. And the justification for contemplative epistemology emerges from the writings of a number of recent critics. The first of whom is Alan Wallace, in this really important book that he published in 2001 called The Taboo of Subjectivity. Wallace writes a sustained critique of how human subjectivity has been written out of the study of consciousness in the sciences and throughout the academy. And he really puts forth an elegant plea to reinstate subjectivity via a form of empiricism accomplished through Buddhist practice. Francisco Varela, the late Francisco Varela, in The Embodied Mind, also published around the same time. No, actually 1990, a decade earlier, along with Evan Thompson and Eleanor Rush. They criticize the limited horizons of the cognitive sciences, especially a very prevalent model that was being used at the time, thinking of human cognition as a computer, using the computer, the way computers function as models to explain human cognition. And the way cognitive science ignores the fully embodied nature of cognition. They advocate what they call Buddhist mindfulness awareness practices to correct this. A new edition of this book came out in 2017. Sadly, Francisco Varela passed away in 2001, but Evan Thompson has continued really thinking seriously about this material and has written a new introduction, and so has Eleanor Rush. I think Eleanor is retired now from UC Berkeley, and Evan holds the chair at UBC. So, out of taking the inspiration from their work, we have put together what we consider 4 important modes of contemplative epistemology. And I'd like to talk to you about them. And let's see if we can engage one particular of these 4 modes to examine our text. Third person is what we normally do and what we feel very comfortable about within the academy. It investigates the so-called external and internal worlds of consciousness from the distance approach of the so-called neutral or objective observer. And we see this common throughout the sciences and also in the humanities and social sciences. Second person epistemologies engage intersubjective communication. They consist of deep listening and empathic concern. They're intersubjective. First person really refers to inner or subjective experience. But within first person, there is something I'd like to call no person experience. And that's immediate experience that is non-intentional and non-self-referential. Non-intentional and non-self-referential. So third person modes are essential to rational scholarship in the humanities and the sciences. But they cannot be relied upon alone to render the best possible research outcomes, especially when consciousness is taken into account. This is because these analytical dualistic perspectives often labor under the pretense, or perhaps the delusion, that they are purely objective, unbiased, and rational. They are commonly contrasted with the much more unreliable, presumably unreliable first-person or subjective modes. First-person modes, in looking at consciousness, first-person modes are grounded in the experiencing subject. They can be critical, they can be uncritical, they can be fixed, they can be flowing, they can be logical, they can be illogical. It's our subjective experience. One reason for the extreme suspicion in which these subjective modes have traditionally been held in the West is the belief that they inevitably have to be uncritical, biased, and illogical. But do they? As long as we remain attached to a fixed and inflexible subjectivity, we have this tendency to be biased and uncritical and sometimes irrational in our approaches to experience. But increasingly, psychologists and cognitive scientists are recognizing different modes of subjective experience that are less biased and uncritical because they are more flexible and able to change and adapt to the constantly changing context in which we find ourselves. These have been suggested by Wallace and Varela Thompson and Rush, but we have attempted to develop them a little bit more. So, of course, they've also been suggested by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in his work on flow. So flow states, once again, are non-intentional. They involve the non-intentional focusing of the attention. So again, the goal isn't to have a contemplative experience. The goal is to not fall off the side of a solid rock face that you're climbing, or to hit a baseball, to recognize the spin on a baseball as it leaves the pitcher's hand. Flow states are absorption in the present moment, present-centered awareness, complete absorption of body and mind in the activity. An activity also that has its own reward. Csikszentmihalyi calls it autotelic. So further research, as collected in this book by Brian Bria, um, have, in this area of flow, have led to the investigation of the phenomenon that scientists are calling effortless attention. Effortless attention means non-intentional, not using the will. It's a focusing of the attention without you having to deliberately focus. So it's spontaneous. It's independent of deliberation, will, and self-direction. And I would argue that this comes about because of the last mode or perspective in contemplative epistemology, and that is this no-person mode or perspective. This represents immediate experience in the present moment, like flow. It is not objectified by the first person experiencing subject. That's something that's often hard to recognize, and that is that experience is constantly changing, and so what's happening in this second often becomes objectified in subsequent moments when you start to think about, did I say the right thing? Did I say the wrong thing? What's the reason this happened? What's the reason that happened? Et cetera, et cetera. So, but from the no person perspective is completely focused in the present moment. It is cognizant without judging. It can involve implicit subject-object distinctions, but not self and other distinctions. It is both embodied and it is non-intentional. Now, this has some common features with, I'm just going to briefly touch upon some cognitive science research, just very briefly, that non-intentional spontaneous experiences are something that are common to human beings. And one of my colleagues here, Takeo Watanabe, along with Aaron Seitz, has done work on what they call task-irrelevant perceptual learning. And the way they define it is that stimulus features that are irrelevant to a subject's task can be learned due to their consistent presentation during task performance. Very briefly, what they discovered is that if you have a stimulus, let's say a visual stimulus or an auditory stimulus at 100% strength, that if they introduce a second source of data, source of information, second stimulus at 80%, we block it at 90, 80, we block, so we're only focused on the main stimulus, all the way down to 22%. But at 22%, for whatever reason, subjects repeatedly in their research and the research of others actually recognize and are able to cognize that second stimulus coming in at 22%. So what they call low-level sub-attentional threshold cues are perceived without the subjects actually deliberately attending to them. As Seitz writes, task-irrelevant perceptual learning is not dependent on attention being directed toward the stimulus array during the period of learning. Now, this work is complemented by Arthur Reber's research on the Gilbert Ryle, Michael Polanyi concept of tacit knowledge, wordless knowledge, knowledge how rather than knowledge of. So tacit knowledge often cannot be made explicit or codified. And if it's made explicit or codified, we don't really understand how to achieve it or to explain it. We exercise this without being aware that we're exercising it, such as automatic habits or routines that we carry out, often very skillfully, with the minimum of conscious attention, like riding a bike or driving or catching a baseball. And we exercise tacit knowledge without being able to explain how we do it, running, walking, etc. So we've got these forms of non-intentional cognition, modes of non-intentional cognition. So in no-person perspective, we also have non-intentional spontaneous cognition. Tacit knowledge is often contrasted with propositional knowledge, which is derived from logical analysis that separates itself from what it is analyzing. So TIPL is task irrelevant perceptual learning, and tacit knowledge lend scientific support to the presence of this non-intentional, no-person mode of consciousness that functions without reference to static concepts of self. And we could go off and talk about William James's and Nishida Kitaro's notions of pure experience, but that would take us too far afield, I think. But happy to do that if it arises in the question period. So, one of the other useful concepts that I've been able to find in neuroscientific research is the distinction between states and traits. And these are, these make sense. Neuroscientific study of meditation has made this distinction between states of experience and traits that are induced by these states. State refers to the altered sensory and cognitive awareness that can arise during meditation practice, but it comes and goes. Trait refers to the lasting changes in these dimensions that persist in the meditator, irrespective of being actively engaged in meditation. Regular contemplative practice can produce relatively short-term states as well as long-term changes in traits. One really good example of this that often gets conflated, and you notice I haven't used the term mindfulness very much because I think it's been overused, and it's come to be a kind of stand-in, a more respectable term for meditation. But really, mindfulness comes from is a somewhat arbitrary, not completely, translation that's, maybe a century and a decade old, that comes out of the Polytext Society in England for the term sati. And sati really means to remember. And so the way I think the term evolved is that sati, translated as mindfulness, is remembering to come back again and again and again to whatever it was you decided to focus on during a particular period of meditation. It's very much intentional as a practice. So mindfulness is a practice to return, to remember to come back to the object of meditation. It can produce a temporary state in which you are mindful and you're focused on that object of meditation, but that comes and goes. And over time, as you practice it more and develop your skill and talent and ability more and more, it actually can become a trait so that you're constantly focused on whatever is occurring in the present moment. So that's, I think it's a very useful distinction between actually practices, states, and traits. Neuroscientific research has also identified two basic categories of meditation practice: the concentrative and the receptive. Concentrative is also called focused attention, and this involves techniques. These are practices that involve top-down focusing of the attention on a specific mental or sensory activity, a repeated sound, or an imagined image. It sounds like a mantra. An image, something that you visualize, specific body sensations, or particularly the breath, which is very common across traditions. And repeated practice over time can eventually lead to complete one-pointedness of the attention. And then you've got receptive or open monitoring meditation. This is the more effortless, involuntary, and inclusive form of practice, in which one learns to allow any thoughts, feelings, and sensations to arise instead of disengaging from them and coming back to the object. Let's say it's a mantra. Let's say it's your breath, at the tip of your nose, different parts of your body. Instead of doing that, then in open monitoring meditation, you just let the contents flow and you keep your focus on the constantly changing contents. Receptive meditation also taps into pre-attentive intuitive mechanisms and can lead to forms of what people call choiceless awareness, free of thoughts. The results of these practices include what neuroscientist Jim Austin calls a shift from self-referential, egocentric cognitive orientations to an other referential, allocentric, other regarding orientation. And he identifies distinct pathways in the brain for each of these, an egocentric network and an allocentric network. In addition to improved attentional focus, these results include increased bodily awareness, improved emotional regulation through decreased reactivity, and what he calls detachment from identification should be to a static sense of self. So where do these leave us? So with these tools, concepts derived from contemplative phenomenology and cognitive psychology and neuroscience, let's go back and look at the philosophy of this foundational work, the Zhuangzi, and the passage about treating yourself as other with new eyes. So, Zhuangzi also thankfully posed for this portrait, and remarkable. We know about Zhuangzi because he's a little bit more solid a figure. He's a lot more solid a figure than the Lao Tzu, because of a biography and the historical records, the Shiji. And the inner chapters in this multidimensional work, which chapters 1 to 7 are the inner, 8 through 22 are the outer, and 23 to 33 are the mixed chapters. They're different strata of the text. The inner chapters are the oldest, and that's what we're drawing from. And that they probably date to sometime around 300 BCE. Might in fact be somewhat a little bit older than the Tao Te Ching. One of the two basic ways, if you think about, China is starting to become, towards the end of this period, literate culture is developing in China. But really up until the beginning of the 4th century BCE, there was mostly transmission orally. So ideas in different intellectual traditions were transmitted from teacher to student, transmitted orally. And they actually were transmitted, and this makes sense, in two forms. One is rhymed verse, 3, 4, 5 character rhyme verse. Either the verse, the rhyme was every line or every other line. And the other primary way is narrative. And narratives, they're stories, basically. And they're easy to tell, they're easy to remember, they're easy to transmit. And the Zhuangzi really contains a kind of mix. Actually, it has a lot more narrative and then little short essay paragraphs where the authors are working out different concepts and ideas that I think derive directly from their contemplative experience. And so the inner chapters that we're looking at, particularly chapter 2, this is probably less narrative and more essay, less poetry and more essay, short essay, than any other one of the chapters in the text. So just to be clear, the most important concept in the classical Tao, in the entire Taoist tradition, is this concept of the way. It's the ultimate unifying power or force that infuses the entire universe. And it's the guiding principle within each phenomenon that enables it to spontaneously move along the natural course of its development. It both transcends any and all phenomena, yet is immanent within them. It's a really important concept. It's transcendent and immanent simultaneously. Yet it is paradoxically impossible to see, hear, touch, feel, or conceive of as an object. And this is probably the most famous passage from the classical Taoist tradition that kind of points this out. It says, this is from a translation I'm working on with a couple of colleagues. A way that can be objectified is not the constant way. A name that can be circumscribed is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of the heavens and the earth. The named was the mother of the 10,000 things. Therefore, it is always so that if you have no desires, you will contemplate its mysteries. It is always so that if you have desires, you will contemplate its manifestations. So this is pointing towards two complementary aspects of the classical Taoist contemplative tradition. One is an apophatic or emptying out dimension or aspect, a contemplative practice that empties out the normal contents of consciousness. We might call it an introvertive contemplative practice, but it is also always so that if you have desires, you will contemplate its manifestations. So you will see, you can experience the Tao directly through sitting meditation, in which all the contents of consciousness fall away and you become one with this underlying power or force. But because the universe is constantly changing, you will come back into a dualistic world. And so it is always so that if you have desires, you live in that world of desire, that you will contemplate the way the Tao is manifested in the world. These two are the same, but are differently named after they emerge. Their sameness is called profound. More profound than profound, this sameness is the gateway to the myriad mysteries. So that's the way the Tao Te Ching approaches the way. Here's how Zhuangzi approaches the way from chapter 2. In quoting a logical hypothesis, this is what Zhuangzi says. So he quotes, "Without an other, there is no self. Without self, no choosing one thing rather than another." And Zhuangzi says, well, this is somewhere near it, but we do not know in whose service it is being employed. It seems that there is something genuinely in command. That is, in command, something, there's an underlying power or force that pervades all distinctions, including this primary distinction between self and other. The only trouble is we cannot find a sign of it. We cannot see it as an object. That as way it can be walked is true enough. So we can walk it, we can act according to it. But we don't see its shape. It has an identity, but it has no shape. If we seem without success to grasp what its identity might be, if we seem without success to grasp what its identity might be, that neither adds to nor detracts from its genuineness. So if we cannot identify it as an object, perceive it as an object, it doesn't mean it's any less genuine. So that points to non-dualistic experience of the Tao. And how do you go about doing that? Well, emptying out apophatic meditation is recommended in passages like the famous fasting of the mind passage. The advice that this is typical of Zhuangzi's sense of humor. He puts the advice in the mouth of Confucius, one of the main rivals to the Taoist tradition at this point in time. Anyway, Confucius teaches his disciple, unify your attention. Rather than listening with your ears, listen with your mind. Rather than listening with your mind, listen with your breathing. Listening stops at the ears. The mind stops at what it can objectify. As for your breathing, it becomes empty and waits to respond to things. The way gathers in emptiness. Emptiness is attained through the fasting of the mind. Mind fasting. Later on in the text, in chapter 6, there's another practice in which actually the disciple is now teaching Confucius how to do this, and it's the famous sitting and forgetting passage. And what the disciple is recommending is stripping away all thoughts, all emotions, all perceptions, all the normal contents of consciousness until one has this experience, ultimate experience of what he calls tong yu da tong, merging with the vast pervader. This is again kind of part of Zhuangzi's unique, evocative way of suggesting something about the Tao. the Tao is that which pervades everything, infuses and pervades everything. He refers to it as the vast pervader. This inner-directed, introverted meditation practice looks a lot like the concentrative or focused attention that we see in the cognitive and sciences and neuroscience. But actually, that's not the goal of practice for Zhuangzi. In his Fasting of the Mind passage, Confucius continues, it is relatively easy to stop walking, but much more difficult to walk without touching the ground. You've heard of using wings to fly. You have not yet heard of flying being wingless. You've heard of using the wits to know, but you have not yet heard of using ignorance to know. The implication here is that actually emptying out the contents of consciousness is comparatively easy. It's returning to the dualistic world and living in that dualistic world without the ground of a fixed sense of self-identity that yields flowing cognition. That's the key challenge in the practice. Not emptying out the contents of consciousness, not the introvertive, not the apophatic. It's the extrovertive. It's the cataphatic. It's living in the world in light of what you experience in the great depths of your introverted meditation. And this actually fits well into the psychological ideas of flow and effortless attention that Csikszentmihalyi and Austin and others have talked about. These apophatic emptying practices of sitting or introverted meditation and their resultant cognitive transformations producing extrovertive focus and spontaneous flowing cognition are most fully detailed in this chapter of Zhuangzi, which spells out the difference between a self-based, fixed and limited cognition, which he calls cognizing by contrivance, and a Tao-based, flowing and unlimited cognition he calls cognizing by circumstance. Cognizing by contrivance brings fixed and rigid categories of true and false, of me and mind, and imprints them on every new situation. And we know, I'm sure, lots of people who are like this. Cognizing by circumstance is grounded in the Tao. It's free from this kind of attachment. It's free from attachments that bind us to rigid worldviews that we take to be ultimately true, but are completely relative. And we see this in the following. As Zhuangzi says, what is it can also be other. What is other can also be it. There someone says, this is true, that's not, from one point of view. And here we say, no. That's true, this is not, from another point of view. Are there really it and other, or really no it and no other? Where neither it nor other finds its opposite is called the axis of the way. Once the axis is found at the center of the circle, there is no limit to responding, with either, on the one hand, no limit to what is it, and on the other, no limit to what is not. And therefore I say the best means is illumination. The person who has been able to merge with the way during introverted meditation is able to remain grounded in the way. For Zhuangzi, experienced as the axis at the center of a circle. He also refers to this in this chapter as finding your place of rest, your point of rest on the potter's wheel of the heavens. If you've ever thrown a pot, you know you have to be dead center. This person's perspective, somebody who can do this in interacting with the world, has fundamentally altered from self-based to Tao-based, and is spoken of by Zhuangzi as illumination. And it is a perfect example, I think, of Austin's shift from egocentric to allocentric. Such a person is free to act through her own identity without being attached to it or biased by it, and so is completely devoid of the self-involved prejudices that most people have our own individual sets of its and others, truths and falses. And I think this is the meaning of to treat oneself as other. It is to be no more attached to your own set of categories and ways of looking at the world as you are attached to anybody else's. And so you can flow from one situation to the next, responding spontaneously and harmoniously. Zhuangzi tells the story called Three Every Morning, in which um, a monkey keeper hands out 3 nuts in the morning. He says, I'll give you 3 in the morning and 4 in the evening. And the monkeys are really upset. They throw a fit. And then he goes, no, no problem. I'll give you 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening. The monkeys are all completely happy. So the monkey keeper can adjust spontaneously and harmoniously to whatever arises. This is why no thing is not other, no thing is not it. If you treat yourself as other, they do not appear. This is why sages open things up to the lucid light of the heavens. Theirs too is a cognizing by circumstance. So to treat yourself as other conveys a non-attachment to the most fundamental of all our cognitive categories, what phenomenologists call ipsity and alterity, selfness and otherness. So hence, treat yourself as other seems to me to be otherizing yourself. And so I referred to it as self-alterity. To be able to do this conveys a profound freedom to change your perspective according to the flow of the constantly changing situations and perspectives we encounter, which have a limited but not an ultimate reality. And this is the last quote from Zhuangzi. The way develops as we walk it. Things become so as we label them. Why so? They are so by being so. Why not so? They're not so by being not so. Therefore, when cognizing by contrivance or fixed cognition differentiates a stalk from a pillar, a leper from the beauty she-sure, things however peculiar or incongruous, the way pervades and unifies them. All things, whether developing or dissolving, are pervaded and unified by the way. Only those who see right through things realize how to pervade and unify. Those who pervade things attain it, and once you attain it, you are just about there. The cognizing by circumstance comes to an end, and when it does, that of which you do not know what is so of it you call the way. Thus, since we cannot know what is so of it, the way remains unknowable as an object, despite the fact that it pervades and unifies our experience from moment to moment. As we saw earlier, for Zhuangzi, the way has identity but no shape. Living in the way conveys a singular freedom, as exemplified in this final passage. Last night, Zhuangzhou, this is the most famous passage in the text probably, dreamed he was a butterfly. Spirit soaring, he was a butterfly, and he did not know about Joe. When all of a sudden he awoke, he was Joe with all his wits about him. And now he does not know whether he is Joe who dreamt he was a butterfly or a butterfly who is dreaming he is Joe. Between Joe and the butterfly, there must be some dividing. Just this is what is meant by the transformation of things. Not only is this narrative the ultimate expression of the idea of treating yourself as other, the transformation of things expresses Zhuangzi's vision of a universe, not of independent, fixed objects moving in space, but of interdependent, constantly changing subjectivities, interacting as they mutually generate within the space-time continuum. These philosophical and scientific perspectives lead to what I've called a condition of cognitive attunement that enables one to live free of attachment to rigid, egocentric, third-person objectifications of self and other, free from excessive self-consciousness, able to act effortlessly, without intentionality, in a mode of no-person orientations to first, second, and third-person experience. Cognitive attunement is a trait change that involves a transformation of cognitive processing away from a self-conscious reliance on third-person doctrines, dogmas, and self-analyses to an increasing reliance on the epistemology of the no-person perspective. It also includes the development of effortless attention and flow-like optimal experience, and it presents a compelling vision of our intricately fundamental interrelatedness, perhaps even more relevant and necessary at this point in the rapidly shrinking world of the 21st century than it was when it was written 2,500 years ago. And with that, I want to thank you all for your patience and perseverance. And I'm happy to answer any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roth. Wow. I knew that you were going to be talking about contemplative studies and talking about Taoism, and somehow you were able to bring them together. It's very rich, very, very dense material. I certainly have a number of questions I would like to ask you, but I know that there are others, and we have some on the panel here that I suppose when you ask questions, maybe you'll just introduce yourselves, Pamela and Catherine. And of course, those in the audience, if you can just, I think it's putting your questions in the chat, right? And we'll be able to read those aloud then to Dr. Roth. So I'm just handing it over to you, Catherine, and Pamela.
Okay, thank you, Anne, and thank you for this wonderful talk, Professor Roth. So I'm Catherine Colbert, and I'm a professor of philosophy in ancient Greek philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. So actually, I have several questions, but I'm going to ask you just one question about the. So you talk about allocentric, and so treat oneself as other. So so I was wondering how this allocentric position or perspective goes with the no person perspective. It seems to me that if we adopt, the other perspective, then we sort of caught in a certain still in duality, whereas the no person perspective seems to me perspectiveless. So if you could just tell me what you think about this allocentric and no person perspective and perspective.
Thank you for your question. So the no person perspective, it's challenging to stay in the no person perspective all the time. I think that the no person perspective, you have to emerge from it from time to time, in order to make plans, in order to figure out what you're going to do tomorrow, in order to organize to cook to cook a souffle or to prepare dinner. I mean, you have to move out of that. So I think we're constantly moving through no person, first person, when we interact with others, second person and third person perspectives, and going back to no person and moving through the other perspectives as they arise. Allocentric versus egocentric refer to kind of more general ways of engaging the world. That from an egocentric perspective, we're looking at the world based on through a fixed sense of self-identity, and that's primarily where we start and primarily where we end up, and we see the world completely in relationship to ourselves, and only in relationship to ourselves. The allocentric perspective is looking at the big picture, looking at the horizon, seeing the other, and seeing the other almost as the self, being so open to the other perspective, the perspective of the other, that in fact, in extreme cases, that you give yourself completely over to that allocentric perspective. So they both evolutionarily developed in humans, and I think that the egocentric perspective has been absolutely necessary, but it's also, I think, important that we develop this bigger picture allocentric perspective. So uh, these kind of, they don't parallel each other. They kind of intersect. They're different ways of looking at human experience, and also the way in which contemplative practices transforms uh, the egocentric perspective over time and enables it to bring in a more allocentric perspective. So it's usually not one extreme or the other. It's some combination.
Yeah, I was more talking from, I suppose, a Buddhist perspective, where, the no self is actually, or no person, as you say, is the goal of the Buddhist practitioner. So, but
That's
yeah.
the no self is for me a concept that's actually fluid, and I think what it means is that there's no fixed and permanent self and self identity, but that if we think about it as something, as a great lack of something, then you're kind of moving towards almost a nihilism, and I think what we have here is an affirmation of a flowing what I would call a flowing sense of self, that for polemical reasons and spiritual polemical reasons, the normative the early Buddhist tradition couldn't actually use use a term that uh, uh, seems to reify the self, because that was already being done in the Upanishadic based Hindu practices, with the emphasis on the deeper Atman that underlies the self, the small s self. So I want to I agree that this no self achievement of no self is a really important part of the process of waking up and seeing things as they really are. But it's no self understood as this because of dependent origination, and there's this constant flow and change. So it's more like a flowing self. Just the early Buddhists can't call it that.
Thank you.
Pamela, did you have a question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Roth. That was an amazing presentation. I got so much from it. My name is Pamela. I'm also from the philosophy department here, and I've taught the Chinese philosophy course to the second year students. And I'm a PhD candidate on multiculturalism here. So yeah, much of what you're saying, I mean, I haven't thought about it quite in relation to cognitive psychology and meditation, but very much in terms of the kind of no self that Zhuangzi would have, very much in agreement with you. And I'm just trying to pinpoint more how you understand it. So, so in saying, for example, that one has an identity without being attached to it, or there is a kind of perspective, well, without an ego, sort of how does the perspective play out in terms of what we learn, or what the perspective that is acquired or conveyed is. And I'm thinking maybe trying to compare it to how Roger Ames has described it, sort of in relation perhaps to the Zhuangzi's epistemology and the happy fish story. So he says that the situation, in a sense, is knowledge is the property of the situation rather than the subject. and that the observed is no more privileged than the observer. So the holistic picture of the situation is codependent on the activity of all the participants within an environment. So in knowing whether the fish are happy, Zhuangzi, Zhuangzi sort of playfully explains that he knows it from the bridge on the river How, and that's the way he knows it. But there is a position in which he knows it. So how does that play into this allocentric perspective or allocentric knowing? Yes.
So what Zhuangzi is affirming, and thank you for the question, Pamela. What I think Zhuangzi is affirming in that passage, Zhuangzi and his friend Huisher are standing on a bridge over a river, and there's fish swimming, and Zhuangzi says, who starts it? Is it Huisher or Zhuangzi who starts the fish are happy?
Zhuangzi says the fish are happy.
Fish are happy. And then Huisher says, well, how do you know the fish are happy?
Yes, yeah.
And then Zhuangzi says, well, I know by standing here on this bridge. And so Zhuangzi's at that moment, I mean, if that's an accurate report and so on and so forth, it's part of a story. But the way I would see it is that he is, being completely allocentric and perceiving everything in that moment, and with very, very keen attention, he sees the movement of the fish, and he almost projects his awareness. Not that he becomes a fish, but he projects himself so completely into the movement of the fish that he perceives that the fish are happy. Almost like he becomes a butterfly in his dream, and then the butterfly dreams he's Zhuangzhou. So I think it's that total allocentricity that enables him to then come back. And again, he comes back to disagreeing, arguing with Huisher, who is his favorite foil. Probably very good friends, as much as we can tell from the surviving text. And he just says, okay, that's how I know it, because right here, from this position right here. It's allocentric, and then it's egocentric, and it's allocentric, and then it's egocentric.
Is there a difference, though, between the way he experiences the fish happiness and the way the fish experiences the fish happiness?
Well, he's not a fish.
So there matters, I guess, because his person is the human, so the species difference matters.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
There are some questions in the chat, so maybe I can just read those to you.
Sure. Please.
Okay, so there's one from Nels Hetty. He asks, doesn't this hinge, and I'm not sure at which point in the lecture the question was asked, but I'll just read it as it is. Doesn't this hinge on a certain use of or disposition towards language, as language is that by which all dualisms and distinctions are made? So it, other, subject, object, all naming, etc. And especially considering the first lines of the Tao Te Ching regarding that which can be said. In other words, how do you regard language in the light of Taoism and Taoist contemplation? And then just a quick follow-up from the same person, is there overlap between this and the Taoist tenet of Wu Wei?
Yes. Let me take it's a very good question. So Wu Wei, actually, I could have talked about two here, and it's an expression. It's the Tao Te Ching's expression for flowing cognition. In a nutshell, so Wu Wei it literally means non-action or not acting, but it's really effortless action. It's action that comes from. It's action that you do, not grounded in the relative position of a fixed self. It's action that emerges through the fixed self. From the Tao. And so it's non-action from the standpoint of a separate sense of self-identity, but it's action from this deeper perspective of the Tao. Now, since the Tao is the underlying power or force within you, and it's the underlying power or force within whatever environment you're in, and the people and the fish, whoever you're interacting with, that from ground to ground, from foundation to foundation, instantaneous, accurate perception happens according to this way of looking at things. And so the cognition is not only spontaneous, and it's not a kind of, we used to back in the day talk about do your own thing. Do your own thing means I'll do whatever I want to whenever I want to do that. But that's from the standpoint of the ego. It's from the standpoint of a fixed sense of self-identity. This is spontaneity that goes from a deeper point, and that's what Wu Wei is. In terms of the use of language, I mean, language often implies dualities, but it doesn't have to. And I think what Zhuangzi is trying to do in certain points is use language evocatively, language to communicate a sense of what his experience is like in a way that somebody else can get a feel for it. So when he talks about and it's an evocative use of language rather than a dualistic or logical, analytical use of language. So when Lao Tzu says the way that can be spoken of is not the constant way, eternal way, the name that can be, or the way that can be objectified, etc., that's a kind of third person standing apart, giving an analysis, the kind of thing that we've grown up with, we're accustomed to. They were doing it 2,500 years ago in China. It's important. It's descriptive. But evocative language is what Zhuangzi is doing when he says, where neither it nor other finds its opposite, is called the axis of the Tao. Where either it nor other finds its opposite. Well, it's just a way of saying, or that the Tao is, when flowing cognition reaches an end, that of which you do not know what is so of it, you call the way. Now, it seems to me that that's a different use of language. That's not standing on the outside looking at the Tao. That's trying to evoke what the experience of the Tao is like. And so I think language can be used in, I would call it almost a non-dualistic, it's a non-descriptive mode or form. It's evocative. And, a lot of poetry functions in that way. So I hope that's answered that question. But it's a good question.
It probably was. It sounds like it was. I'm going to read on. I'm going to read the next question. So thank you for that. And this comes from Melanie Coughlin, who says, thank you for sticking with us this evening. And I think we all want to echo that, Dr. Roth. Melanie then asks, I'd like to know how you see the role of historical knowledge in your conception of the no-person mode of subjectivity. For example, is historical knowledge about conditions that are not apparent in immediate experience necessary for becoming other to oneself in the prejudice-free way that you describe?
That's a really interesting question. So historical knowledge, comes about, it's really third-person knowledge. And it's really important to, for example, I think third-person knowledge and historical knowledge, and then it's extremely important when we're looking at contemplative practices and contemplative techniques, and when we decide to follow or practice certain practices or techniques. It's very easy to take, and I think one of the criticisms that I would make of the various mindfulness practices that have developed in the last 30 or 40 years is that they've kind of they're deracinated practices. And being deracinated, that means they're taking out, they're removed from their historical and cultural roots. And there are problems of cultural appropriation with that. They're also limited in how far they can take the person who's practicing them. They're really good. They're really helpful. It's been very important that more people have the opportunity to do these practices. But historical knowledge can help enable you to even know that no person mode, which has been that scientists are finally starting to recognize has actually been perceived, developed, cultivated in traditions going back 2,500 years. Confucian and Taoist and Buddhist traditions have, especially the Buddhist, the Neo-Confucian tradition, but that's later. But the Taoist and the Buddhist traditions throughout Asia have focused on one dimension of them has been not just to lose the self, but to reconstitute the self in a no-person mode. I think present-oriented experience, no-person experience, is something that hasn't been cultivated historically in European traditions, but has been cultivated for 2,500 years in these other traditions from Asia. And I think it's important to know that. Plus, the deracinated practice only takes you so far. And I think some of the leading teachers of MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, now are, we have a center here at Brown, and I talk to them quite a bit, and they realize that there's a limit to how far you can go, and that you need to look at historically created, culturally derived sources of these practices in order to deepen your awareness of them.
Because it's already past 8:30, I'm wondering, would you be willing to answer another question or two? What I was thinking of doing, there's 3 questions. There's 2 from one individual and then 1 short question. Maybe I'll just read them and then you'll decide which you want to answer. And I'll hold my questions for Wednesday when you're joining our class. How's that? Okay. Sure. This is from Putiran, Jay Putiran. First question is, which is a contemplatively oriented question. So towards the end, you mentioned that Zhuangzi says that we cannot know what is so of things. Buddhists make the jump from this to say that there is something, Buddhists make the jump from this to say that there is therefore nothing that is so of anything. Does this change our response to the world in any way? That is, if there is nothing that is so of things, as opposed to merely not knowing what is so of things, do the same conclusions reached with Zhuangzi follow? So that's question 1. Shall I just continue with question 2? And then
just let me give a quick response, and then I'm happy to answer the other question.
Okay, thank you.
So what I think Zhuangzi's position is not that that there's nothing that is so of things. There's nothing that is ontologically so of things. So the dualistic knowledge is relative to the standpoint of the person who is professing that knowledge. And so from that standpoint, and from this what he calls fixed cognition or contrived cognizing, from that standpoint, nothing is ultimately so. But there's a different mode he talks about as it's Ming, or illumination, and that is this mode of cognition which is grounded in the Tao, and then through that Tao you can flow into things. And so what's so in a given situation is so in that situation, but in the next situation it may not be so. And if it's always so from one situation to the next, then you can't adjust yourself to the different circumstances of the second or the new situation. I also am not sure that I would agree that the Buddhist tradition says that there's nothing that is so of anything. I think that it's also potentially a misinterpretation of the doctrine of emptiness, if that might be underlying this idea that nothing is so of anything. And with emptiness in the Buddhist tradition, you always have to ask, empty of what? And there's something very, very specific with the term shunyata. It's a product that's called a dharma nisvabhava, all things, and that means things in the external world, but also moments of experience, are empty of svabhava, own being, independent existence. So, in fact, emptiness isn't really empty. It's not nihilistic at all. It's not saying that there's nothing that's so of anything. It's saying everything is relational. Everything is related. So nothing is independent. Everything arises due to this vast matrix of causes and conditions that change from one moment to the next. So it's an affirmation of the flowingness of things rather than the independent stability of things and the unrelatedness of things. So I hope that answers your question, Putiran.
I think that the way in which you answered it actually addresses the second follow-up question here. So I'll just go to that. It's more of a philosophically oriented question. Can you point to any studies on the development of Taoist thought, specifically if it emerged or grew through cross-cultural dialogue? For example, Taoism and Mahayana Buddhism have some similarities, right? And you seem to be pointing those out. Could Taoism have influenced and caused the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, or could Taoism have been influenced by external influences?
Yeah, so that's a
big one. Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating to look at that. Okay, so when I first started coming up with the ideas that went into my book Original Tao, I gave a lecture at a conference at University of Pennsylvania, and there's a scholar there named Victor Mair, M-A-I-R. Maybe some of you have heard of Victor, and Victor has this theory that meditation in China came from India, came across the Silk Road at a much earlier date, and was originally developed in North India in particular, and is expressed. We see evidence of it in the Upanishads, and maybe from the 8th century, 7th century BCE, and that it came into China. And he was very excited because of the discovery. He was very influential in the discovery of the Tokharian mummies. Not the discovery of them, but the preservation of them. I don't know if any of you know about this, but in the area at the far eastern end of the Silk Road, where the Silk Road is ending, there's a place called the Tarim Basin, and they've been able to find two incredibly well-preserved corpses. They call them mummies because it's almost like they're mummified, but it's the arid conditions that mummified them. And they have clothing, and they have features, and they're blonde-haired and blue-eyed, both of them. One radiocarbon dates to about 1000 or 1100 BCE. The other radiocarbon dates to about 1800 BCE. And based on textiles, analysis of textiles and analysis of DNA, this group of people is most closely related to the modern group of people descended from the Celts. So there were Celts or Celtic people in the northwestern part of China, probably going back to 2000 BCE, which is kind of mind-blowing. So Victor thinks it is through that kind of migration that South Asian, North Indian yoga goes over the Silk Road and into China, and then he thinks it influences the development of meditation in the Taoist tradition. I'm not convinced that just because you have yoga and meditation in India, you've got the mummies, that the Chinese couldn't have come up with similar kinds of practices on their own. So that's one answer, looking at the kind of non-Taoist influence on Taoism. But then in terms of Mahayana Buddhism, yeah, this is very interesting. Certainly, the Mahayana Buddhist texts first come into China around 150 of the Common Era. And they start with breathing meditation texts, the Anapanasati Sutta, mindfulness of breathing, but they also have some early perfection and wisdom, Mahayana texts. And the way in which these texts were received and interpreted was very influenced by the existing Taoist tradition, as it was in the second and third centuries of the Common Era. Then these two kind of separate streams merge, and then they influence the development of distinctive forms of mostly Mahayana Buddhism in China. And the one that most people know about is Chan and then later Zen. So it's a very interesting and complex question that I could probably talk about for another hour, but that would definitely, when Anne and I decided that we would have this talk at 7 o'clock at night, I said that I would do my best to put people to sleep because I would try to imitate my old friend Leonard Cohen, and with his really, soft and deep tones, and that I would eventually, as I often do with my own students, lull you into and kind of escort you into your nightly rest. But before doing that, I'm happy to answer any other questions that are still hanging around here.
There's two comments. I don't think they're questions. I'll just read them aloud to you. Cynthia Lee says, in quote, treat others as you want to be treated. And then versus, quote, treat yourself as others. Sort of just commenting on perhaps maybe wanting you to comment, but I think making an observation of the similarity and perhaps differences between those conceptualizations of self and other. And then the last comment was again from Nils Hefty. Just want to say thanks to Dr. Roth and for the rest for this great lecture on a profound and important subject. And so just to say how much it was appreciated. So I thought that was a nice one to close off on. I don't know, Hal, if you wanted to say something about the question of treating others, or if it was just, we'll leave it at that.
Treat others as you wish yourself to be treated. Of course, the golden rule. And the Confucians actually have a way of talking about that, about do not treat others as you would not like yourself to be treated. But the Taoists, to treat yourself as other is a kind of more radical version of that, where you're otherizing yourself to such an extent that your own, whether or not somebody responds to you as you wish, doesn't really influence. You're so unperturbed. You're such an unperturbed mind, such equanimity that whether or not they do that doesn't faze you. So, and you take their perspective into account just as much as you take your own perspective. So I think it's really the basis of empathy, of actually being able to feel what they're feeling, what somebody else is feeling, which often what gets in the way is our own sense of a fixed self-identity. We can't look at another's point of view. We can't see the world from another viewpoint. And so what Zhuangzi is actually talking about here is this kind of radical otherizing yourself, self-alterity, or totally being able to put yourself into the experience of somebody else. And in order to do that, you have to first lose the attachment that we normally have to a fixed sense of our own self-identity.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you for what was, I think we would all agree, a very rich, very erudite presentation delivered with humor and equanimity. Again, thank you so much for staying with us, despite being knocked off not once but twice. So it's been wonderful. Thanks. A real treat for us this evening.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Professor Vallely, and thanks so many of you for hanging out and staying here all this time, despite being knocked off a couple of times, and for the very interesting questions that you asked. I look forward to seeing some of you in Professor Vallely and in Catherine's class on Wednesday.
On Wednesday, the day after tomorrow, we get to continue this conversation then. Yes. Wonderful. Thanks again.
So, thank you all, and good night. Sleep well.
And we have a few more events coming down the pipe for the Academy of Mindfulness and Contemplative Studies, but I don't have them in front of me to tell you what they are. So please just take a look at our website. One of them is going to be a research day for graduate students in April, and then there'll be another speaker, at least one more speaker in May. So we'll have that posted, in the next week or so. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a good night.